to about myself.
Well, I think addressing childhood trauma is extreme. I mean, I didn't realize that I had any, I thought I had a pretty regular childhood, you know what I mean? And then in actually kind of reviewing it, I'm like, oh, I could see how that would actually be kind of traumatic, There was, definitely facets that even a fairly normal upbringing, because a lot of times, and this is what's actually really confusing for people, and I could talk about this for a minute too, but there's always some worse case. Like they weren't chained up in the basement getting just whipped and starved. And so they think that there's just no right to have any symptoms from anything, Well, there's always a more extreme example. And I see this a lot of times with veterans with PTSD. They're like, I didn't even really see combat, but for some reason I have these symptoms,
How does that work?
Stress over time. So, you can have one acutely stressful event that causes amygdala hypertrophy, or you can have stress over time.
Would you say that again slower, that word?
Yeah, so your amygdala, the fear center of your brain, this is more complex than this, but this is as with all things neurochemistry, brain, whatever, it's always way more complex than, you can't really sum it up in a sentence. But generally speaking, the amygdala gets too big. So hypertrophy just means growing, like when your muscle gets bigger, it hypertrophies, right? So when you do brain scans on people who've, been through traumatic experiences, especially a lot of traumatic experiences over time, they inevitably usually have an enlarged amygdala and an atrophied cerebral cortex. And basically what that means is your brain is now primed to do very specific things. Don't think about things too deeply. Don't think about abstract thoughts too much. Don't be daydreaming all day, because we need to be on alert, And so you become, hyper attenuated, hyper vigilant, any way you want to term it. You get ready for action at any moment. You get that on-off switch is just ready to go on, and stay on, and it can't come off very easily at all. And, that's what I dealt with quite a bit was, and a lot of times it's kind of obscure things. It's not even always the thing that you experience. It's sometimes just being in an environment where you might experience something like that. So in other words, it's not that you got blown up in a roadside bomb, but you have 5 friends that did, and you're regularly doing the same thing that they did. And so you're like, you're ready to go. You do that to yourself over a period of time, you expose yourself to those situations for long enough, and inevitably you're going to have actual cerebral changes that there is, the way you see it is then these symptoms of PTSD and things like this.
If your environment has the expectation,
sometimes that's a factor that's overlooked. So as an example, so kids that grew up in a high stress environment, maybe a parent was abusive. Well, maybe they weren't abusive that much, but generally speaking, they were on edge all the time. They're on eggshells all the time. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that has as much of an impact, or even the way that it felt to the child. So in other words, and this isn't totally my specialty, I'm not a therapist or anything, but this is just my understanding of it. It's just the way that it felt to the child sometimes is as much of an impact as the actual events that happened. So maybe a child felt unloved. Maybe the parents were working really, really hard to make them feel loved, but there was just a few factors that happened at certain times that made the child generally feel unloved, that has the exact same impact as if they were, and over time, the same physiological impact as if there was actually an acutely, stressful event, And so a lot of times these things are completely overlooked.
Internal environment is what you're saying is as important as external environment and direct experience.
Well, I think sometimes people feel shame in that they have symptoms, or they'll ignore their symptoms because it wasn't as extreme as somebody else's. They didn't do 4 tours in Iraq, so they can't say they have PTSD. And this is what happens to first responders all the time. They're like, I work on an ambulance. Okay, but you've been dealing with these really, really, really stressful events over and over and over again for a very long period of time, and that is genetically, maybe you were predisposed to have these cognitive changes more than another person, or not. That's always a part of the mystery. Some people have 20-year careers as police officers and experience all kinds of stuff and have no symptoms. Genes may play a role in this that we'll later identify. But I think really what it is you meet these people and they get shot at earlier in the day, and they're just kind of like, yeah, well, it was what it was, It didn't feel like anything to them, for whatever reason. The way that they frame it cognitively, they don't hold any importance to it. Maybe how important they hold their life even, So some people are just more affected by stress over time, than, or an acutely stressful event than others. Maybe genetics, maybe more just the way they kind of frame it. But either way, once you get, underway with these cognitive changes, hypertrophied amygdala, atrophied, cerebral cortex, you think differently, and it becomes very difficult to think of positive thought about yourself or, about anything else or any situation or see the positive in a situation.
Are those symptoms?
They are. I mean,
like the lack of something, is that a symptom?
There's a lot of symptoms. There's a whole checklist of it. I mean, but obviously revisiting it. I mean, really what it is this segment of your brain is firing, and it's saying, should I be scared of something? Should I be getting prepared for something? How high do I need to make my heart rate right now? How much adrenaline do I need pumping through my veins all the time? And then you deal with dips, right? Because when you're just pumping out adrenaline all the time, then you get these depression dips, because you just can't keep up at that state for too long, You get fatigued. And so that's why these things sort of blend, like, oh, okay, I went through a stressful event, or, due to my childhood, I generally speaking frame things in my head like this over time for a period of time, and then there's just this cognitive shift that occurs, But especially with and I've seen some studies on drug and alcohol addictions in particular, childhood trauma is one of the biggest factors. If you had childhood trauma, your odds of actually inevitably ending up addicted to a substance at some point in your life just skyrocket, and so, and obesity, a lot of times we see people who are obese, we think, they're lazy, something like this. When you actually interview these people, very oftentimes they had childhood trauma. So, they've been using food as a means to feel better, and people use all kinds of means to feel better. And so when you actually start to have sympathy for those childhood traumas, and you start to really, get some data on it, you start to realize this person's just not lazy and fat. This person's got significant cognitive problems that could be addressed, could be fixed, and they're just being ignored. And we're just like, oh, go jump on a treadmill. They'll never get anywhere with that method.
Don't you think that everyone has childhood trauma? I mean, relatively speaking, everyone has ups and downs.
Yeah.
And as a child, you don't have very much choice in anything.
Yeah.
Isn't a 3-year-old traumatized all the time?
In the Buddhist culture,
Because they're always crying.
they talk about the conditioned mind, right? So they basically say, as you progress through childhood and you become an adult, your brain becomes conditioned. Basically what they're talking about is everybody experiences some bullshit as they age. And it's your job in adulthood to decondition your mind, And so to see through the patterns that you've developed in childhood, and now that your brain has actually developed enough to do that, and then, grow from there. So in their culture, they believe everybody's screwed up. That's just growing up. In our culture, we're like, why do you think that you're screwed up? What happened to you that makes you think that you have the right to even say that you are screwed up from your childhood? Just two completely different competing cultures, But I kind of agree with that more Buddhist mindset that no matter what you go through in childhood, good, bad, and different, either way, it conditioned your mind. And that's either serving you or it's not. And you can work on that in adulthood, but you can only work on it in adulthood. Only once you do finally reach a certain level of maturity can you actually start to reflect on some of these things and go, well, yeah, I generally speaking don't trust people with money. Or, well, what's behind that? Oh, well, I grew up with less. My parents made a lot of negative statements about people with money. Do I really hold that belief system towards people with money? Are they really out to get me? Or authority figures, or whatever else it may be, A lot of times that kind of stems from the way that your parents felt, or how you felt about your own parents' authority, Now you're dealing with dysfunction towards, police officers and things like this,
So it sounds like a condition of experiences create a pattern of conditioning. And then those conditions, the person learns skills based off of those conditions, right? They learn how to avoid something or go towards another thing. For instance, if it's I have a anti-authority bent to me, so I naturally am distrusting towards authority unless they can prove themselves to me. But then once they prove themselves, I'm all for it, right?
Yeah.
But it sounds like, is that kind of a correct.
So there's a distrust towards authority because maybe, I'm just taking ganders and shots in the dark, who knows, but it's possible that your authority figures growing up, maybe from time to time, they were screwing up in some kind of way. They were making themselves not seem so altogether to the point where they weren't really a trusted authority figure. So now you don't trust any authority figure. Now you have to figure out in adulthood, does that mindset serve me anymore? It did as a child, you know. Did everything that mother or father or whoever always say, was that always right? Sometimes they would tell me things and it turned out to not be right, you know. Santa Claus wasn't real, you know, turned out.
It's the first conspiracy.
Yeah. Inevitably, that's kind of the thing, is you have to kind of decipher these things in adulthood and figure out if they're serving you anymore, you know. And a lot of times they're pretty hardwired. You know, I like to think of it like the base of the tree. You know, it's like, you know, your upbringing is that trunk and these you know, big branches. You know, a lot of times if there's an issue with one of these, everything on the periphery is kind of messed up. You know, and so the way that you have your romantic relationships, you know, probably stems from the way your parents' relationships were, you know, stems from the way you were held as a baby. You know, it's just like these things kind of blossom out in that way. You know, so a lot of times when you're having a more peripheral issue of like, I don't really trust this friend or something like that. So maybe the core might have been really early on.
There's a lot of patterns in life that it's impossible to understand. Like, why does this keep happening, right? Unless you have some sort of therapy, some sort of outside person that's helping you guide.
It's a lot easier to see somebody else's problems than it is your own. Mm-hmm. So when you talk to a friend, a lot of times you go, dude, you gotta quit this, or just leave that chick, or whatever it is. It's like so obvious to you, but it's not so obvious to them. And I mean, I think that alone is a huge benefit. But then training, you know what I mean? So you learn a lot, and then they're doing this all day, every day, right? So therapists talk to people all day, every day. They get good at pattern recognition and sort of a precognition about, like, as soon as they look at somebody, they can kind of already be like, wow, this person probably struggles with this. Because after a period of time of just doing this all day, every day, you get really good at it, no matter who you are. So that's really what you're vetting with a therapist. And, you know, just like anything else, there's good and bad and different. And you also need to find fit. So, and I went through like 3 therapists before I found one that was actually like, I felt like beneficial at all. And the one that I finally found, he wasn't even the best therapist, but he was really like action oriented. So he was like, okay, cool. I don't really want to hear you complain about it anymore. I'd like to figure out what we can do about it now, you know, to move on. And the first time he ever kind of told me that, I was kind of like, what? Like I thought I just wanted to sit here and complain, you know. And that he realized right away, like, this guy's not going to go anywhere with that. He wants something to do. He wants some homework. Blah, blah, blah. He's like, cool. You get anxious about these events. Can you meditate about them before? You know, can we journal about it? Can we whatever? You know, I don't want to hear about it again because this pattern keeps happening for you. I just want to figure out what we can do to fix it and move on. That's atypical for a therapist, for sure, but it worked well with me.
Totally. Like,
and I don't know if he does that with his other, did it with his other clients, but, you know, it works well for me. I think anybody could benefit from therapy. You know what I mean? I think just any person experiencing the human condition could probably have somebody to talk to from time to time and allocate a period of time for their mental health. It's kind of like going to the dentist and getting a cleaning, you know? It's kind of like, you know, there's just certain things we realize that you have to maintenance as a human on planet Earth. And we just, our culture, you know, mental health is so taboo. We just think you should have it together for no reason. That's just obviously not the case. You know, I mean, by the numbers, you know, it's not. But, you know, there's massive suicide rates. You know, it's certain populations, the leading cause of death, you know. That's crazy, you know. And, you know, and well, suicide is the, you know, end of the continuum of depression for sure, you know.
They say depression's like a silent killer, right? Because people live with varying degrees of depression their whole life, and they might not ever want to commit suicide or ever feel it enough to take action on suicide, but they'll still be depressed as fuck, and that will ruin the rest of their potentiality, right?
I learned early on in my career that you really can't tell. So my best friend James, you know, he committed suicide. He was a paramedic for Austin. The last time that I talked to him, you know, we got together, had drinks. We would talk about EMS calls all the time because he worked for one system, I worked for a different one. So we'd just kind of catch up and a lot of times he'd just be kind of like, oh man, I'd have done this, and you know, you kind of fucked up, like you should have done this intervention instead of that one. And I kind of rag him the other way too. Well, so he's telling me about this 17-year-old girl that he treated, and she had multiple gunshot wounds. He took her to the hospital, and I'm kind of like, you probably gave her too much fluids, you know, and like kind of ragging him on what he did. And this was pretty typical. And, you know, I completely missed that this guy was saying that he had a really hard time with this call, right? And he had a lot of other hard calls too. And his EMS partner, who he had worked with for some period of time, actually had left a 24-hour shift and inevitably ran into a guardrail and died just recently. And he was dealing with some drinking problems. He had been, you know, dealing with trying to get that under control for some time. And, you know, all kinds of stresses in relation to his children and other things, you know. But talking to this guy, you'd never know that he was really all that depressed. He was really happy, always joking. You really couldn't tell. And, you know, a lot of that was a cover-up. I mean, the guy was actually an actor for a significant period of time in his life. He was really good at putting on a different face than he actually had going on internally. This period of time, though, I remember this conversation, and like it was the only time that there was never any like joking or anything about it. He was just bothered by this call. He had a 17-year-old daughter that looked a lot like this girl that he had just ran to the hospital, and it just really hit close to home.
That's fucking hard.
Yeah, and that was the last time I ever talked to him, because he shot himself shortly after. You know, and I don't know if it had anything to do with this call or something other thing that I didn't even know about or whatever else, but if you had asked me, you know, before that, is there any possibility this guy committed suicide? I'd be like, absolutely not, James. There's no freaking way. That's not the guy, you know. And you can't tell what's going on internally with somebody, you know, a lot of times. And so some people, you know, it's a lot more outward about it, but there's plenty of people that just walk around with, you know, really poor mental health all the time, you know, and there's just no outward sign. It's not like, you know, diabetes where you're about to lose a leg or something like that. You can just be rotting on the inside and not know.